Hello and welcome to another episode of The Learning Curve. I'm your host, Julia McLeod. Please join me in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, enable me to teach with wisdom, for I help to shape the mind. Equip me to teach with truth, for I help to shape the conscience. Encourage me to teach with vision, for I help to shape the future. Empower me to teach with love, for I help to shape the world. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of Treaty 6 and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4, in which many Indigenous peoples have come before us to call home. We acknowledge the contributions that the Indigenous peoples have provided to help shape our past, present, and future. We commit to restoring and honoring the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and believe that together our collective communities can build a stronger understanding of all people who dwell on this land and who call it home. We are recording today from our beautiful new studios here at Lumen Christi, our common home in Edmonton Catholic Schools. Today's episode title is Building Strong Math Communities Together. The agenda for today's episode begins with our TSA segment, Tricky Situations in Assessment with Nicole Lafreniere, our Director of Curriculum and Assessment. In this segment, Nicole will help us navigate and land on solutions to difficult situations in assessment. Our guest today is Lise Hartzell. She is a teacher at J.S. Picard School who is part of the math department. She'll speak to us about how her department and teachers at her site collaborate so that students can win. We'll then have our segment, We're Still Doing That, with Deputy Superintendent Tim Cusack, where we'll explore outdated assessment practices and gain solutions to help us move forward. That's the plan for today. Let's jump right in. Teacher Daniel wishes his students would focus on learning rather than the grade. What do you advise?
This is always a little bit of a struggle because, of course, we want kids to care about the learning and not necessarily the grade. And the flip side of that is, how do you get kids to also want to demonstrate their learning? I have a son who feels that, he knows it in his head, so does he really need to prove it to anyone? But at the end of the day, you do kind of have to, because grades matter for things like getting into a post-secondary. So it is about establishing that classroom culture of learning and an ongoing sense of purpose. I think about Daniel Pink's work where he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose, that we have to be able to have some voice and choice in what we do in order for something to be meaningful to us. We have to feel like we're getting good at it. That's that mastery piece. And then, of course, we have to have purpose for what we're doing. And so that is something that I would maybe send Daniel back to do a little bit of thinking about, is, has he set those three things up within his classroom in order for students to start to take control of their own learning? Because I find that a useful framework.
Welcome to the show, Lise.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's just begin. Tell me a bit about yourself and what brought you to education, and a bit about your career so far.
Sounds good. So I was a classic teacher's kid. My mom was a teacher and my dad taught at a college too. So being around education and being at school a lot, I kind of fell in love with the culture and just the change and the impact you can have on students. And my mom was especially involved in coaching, and I was really into sports. And so that was another draw to education, was to get involved in athletics. So I've been with the district for 5-6 years now and been really enjoying it, and kind of have really immersed myself, not in the school, just in the school culture at J.H. Picard, but also within the math community with the district.
So let's get into the episode. Today we're going to talk about math and working collaboratively as a math team in a junior high school. So can you tell us a bit about your experience joining the math team at JH Picard and how you were able to integrate into this culture of collaboration that they have established there?
Yeah, so that culture was very much established when I first arrived at JH Picard. I was immediately involved in the math junior high and high school team, and they included me in the assessment practices, the pedagogy, the approaches, and there was a lot of mentorship. And as a newer teacher to the district, it was really refreshing. I had been with previous districts where you were very much an island. And so being involved in the collaboration and being given resources to start with and being included in the conversations with further improving and discussions on teaching practices was very encouraging. It was just a way easier way to step into a new role.
Yeah, so how does this collaborative working environment within the math team contribute to a strong math program?
So I've seen firsthand that collaboration with teaching approaches, common language, especially in French immersion, similar types of assessments or similar expectations established with students creates clarity in student learning, and it sets students up for success. I teach mostly grades 7 and 8, so a lot of what we do in grades 7 and 8 is establishing cultures, establishing routines, and students are starting to work on skills that they need, not just for grade 7, so that by the time they get all the way to grade 9 and even high school, they're familiar with things that they're going to need for the PAT, and specifically, being comfortable with numeric response questions, being comfortable with different styles of multiple choice, and even, down to specifics like how questions are asked. So I see that kids get used to the classroom expectations, the strategies that work throughout their junior high and high school experiences. And so that common ground with teachers, I've seen it work. I've seen kids continue to use strategies throughout junior high and high school.
Yeah, you're talking about having grade 7, grade 8, grade 9, 10, and 11, and 12, the math program really working in that continuum that's intended by the Alberta Program of Studies. Can you speak a bit to how your team plans for this and ensures that assessments are fair and valid measures of student learning?
Absolutely. So we spend time, and that's the big thing here. That is the challenge, is we have to take time to have discussions about teaching practice and then discussions about the assessments and the resources that we use. So we're often having the resources on the smartboard in a room together, spending time looking over what are we asking in these questions, what are we looking for. And so all our formative assessments are done collaboratively, and all our summative assessments are done collaboratively. And we know that when you make something, we are biased. And so we don't see some of the glaring obvious mistakes, or we don't see how questions can be misleading. And so having second, third set of eyes and different perspectives, and also just we're talking math here. You want to make sure that you're not making numerical mistakes in solutions and whatnot. So it just really helps to have a collaborative approach. And so that we want to make sure that our formative assessments, everything that we do in class, is setting our students up for success on their summatives. And so anything that we're doing has to be preparing them for the summative, so that the summative is a fair assessment, so that students have, and that's how math is learned, the opportunity to practice, make mistakes, learn from their mistakes, so that they're better prepared for their summatives. So their summatives are not surprises. They've seen that type of question or that style of question. They know what to expect. And so there's lots of clarity in learning and clarity in what they're going to be assessed on.
Data analysis has come to the forefront in Edmonton Catholic schools over recent years with our introduction of CSAs, Common Summative Assessments, and CFAs, Common Formative Assessments at a division level. Can you speak a bit to how your team uses data to drive your practice?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was pretty lucky because Connor Renshaw was a teacher at JH Picard when I first began. So Picard has been doing and using Smarter Marks for data analysis for a while. So the CSAs and CFA introduction wasn't a shock to the Picard students or community because it was very much in line with what we were doing. Now, Smarter Marks has been a phenomenal tool to not only report on where students are, because you're attaching outcomes to specific questions, and so students and parents have a lot of clarity on where their child is at in every single outcome. It also informs teaching practice, understanding where your kids are struggling and whatnot. But it also, as far as building assessments, helps teachers make sure that the assessments are fair, that they're performing well. And so we're looking at discrimination, and we're looking at the data of how the question actually performs, how the questions perform, so that we want our high achieving students to be doing well on the high difficulty questions. And so you want the questions to be fair, and you want them to be performing well. And when they don't, it informs you that there are changes that need to be made to the questions.
Yeah, you're talking about blueprinting of exams is really what we're doing with the use of Smarter Marks. Can you speak a bit to how the learning outcomes in the program of study help feed that?
Absolutely. Your assessments have to be based on the program of studies, right? So it becomes glaringly obvious if you are following the program of studies or not when you're thinking of attaching outcomes to every individual question. And so you can see if your exam is well balanced, if it's assessing all outcomes, and how many questions pertain to each individual outcome. So every evaluation has to be associated to the program of studies. And when you do exams with Smarter Marks, it really does guarantee that you are intentionally building exams.
I'd like to circle back on something that you were talking about a bit earlier. It's the concept of time, how we have to make time as a team to do this collaborative work. Can you speak a bit to how time looks in reality? How's that time found?
So it's found in the 5 minutes before class starts and the breaks in between. We communicate a lot via Teams. I know that I had spoken about meeting in person and the importance of that, and we do. So that's after school when we can find 5-10 minutes or half an hour here or there. But it's also done throughout the day on Teams. We have a group Teams message, and we're constantly sharing, going back and forth, and it makes it more efficient, especially with the SharePoint, and we have common folders. We're able to make edits and see edits in real time. So when you make an assessment, you don't have time to meet after school to discuss, you can say, okay, have a look, give me feedback, and then we can see in real time, and you're not having to share documents back and forth because it's already in the folder. So I would say because time is an issue, if you're not able to meet in person, utilize Teams. That has been a really great tool for us. But it's basically, it has to be a commitment, and it has to be important to the math team for it to be successful, because it is time consuming.
I'm hearing that your math team is very cohesive and people are on the same page. When we think about professional learning communities or communities of practice, we establish norms. Those can be very explicit usually, but sometimes they're implicit. How are norms a part of your collaborative work?
So the norms are established through a lot of discussion. We seek to find common ground. Obviously, every teacher has their own style, and there are differences in opinions and in approaches, but we basically meet and we establish some foundational goals that we all agree on. You're not going to be able to agree on everything, but we have, as a team, have established that we want to emphasize formative. And so a big part of our culture at Picard is formative. And we do a lot of formative feedback. We call them tests to 100%, essentially the idea that students work on a test until they get 100%. And so they keep trying and they keep trying. And that is something that, that's one of the norms, I guess, we have decided on. We also have committed to pre-exams as formative assessments, and then the style of summatives that we do, notably like numeric response without a calculator, and then multiple choice style questions. So there are things that we don't necessarily agree on or don't do similarly. Sometimes there's differentiation in the teaching approach and the teaching style. However, we have, as a cornerstone, agreed on how we are going to evaluate and what type of formative assessments we're going to give students.
Okay, we're going to pivot a bit. Can you describe a specific instance where collaboration among the math teachers has led to a positive outcome for a student or for the math program as a whole? You can pick how you respond to that question. So a specific instance where collaboration had a visible impact.
Sure. I have seen that students who came into grade 7 at Picard, maybe with some foundational gaps, especially with the pandemic, the work that I did with that student in grade 7 and the continuation of that work with another teacher once that student moved up to grade 8, we saw that the investment that was made and the continuation of that, specifically in the language used, the teaching approach, we've been really focusing on conceptual understanding. And so as a math team, we have decided on certain approaches that we were going to collaboratively integrate into our teaching. For example, box method for multiplication of decimals. That's something, or multiplication of any number, but that's a strategy that we decided, okay, we're going to start this in grade 7, and we might not see the fruit of that in grade 7, but if we continue with that strategy, we will eventually help these students understand conceptually multiplication and provide them with strategies that will be effective. And so it was very much the case of this student struggled, and it was a struggle in grade 7, but they got it by grade 8. So it was, you don't always see the benefits or the fruit of your work, but knowing that the good work is continued by your colleague in future years, and having that discussion to say, hey, so-and-so, how are they doing? And to hear that, okay, they got it, is really rewarding.
That's wonderful to hear that reward. That's really what we want as teachers is to see that growth in our students and that mastery towards their learning. Now that we're talking about students, how does this work support differentiated instruction and diverse learners in the classroom?
Yes. Okay. So as a district and as our school, we've been really embracing Peter Liljedahl and Pam Harris's work. And we've been doing small group, we've been doing board work, and we've also been doing just a lot of class discussion on conceptual ideas in math. And what we've noticed is that in order to do inclusion and integration well for students that are behind, you have to lower the entry point. And Pam Harris is all about that with problem strings, because it is really difficult to find time to always be one-on-one with all the students that are in need, especially since nowadays the average classroom doesn't have 1 or 2 students that are behind. We have multiple. And so it is no longer practical or feasible to have one-on-one time with every single student who requires that intervention. So you need to be creative and do your best at incorporating that intervention into your everyday teaching and include everybody. And that is challenging, but we have found that when you lower the entry point and you allow students to talk amongst themselves, you don't need to be the hero all the time as the teacher. You don't always need to be the one running the show. And you can really be creative. Pam Harris with Problem Strings has really changed the way that I do inclusion in the classroom setting, and I have seen the fruits of it. Like, I've seen the benefits and seen that when you lower the entry point, students are experiencing success and they're feeling encouraged, and it motivates them to keep going.
I'm hanging on to your soundbite there. You don't always have to be the hero. I think that's sometimes scary for teachers, that release of control, and that putting the ownership of learning on the students and really involving them in that learning process that you're alluding to in Littledale and Harris's work. How does the math team ensure that the assessments and the work that you're doing collaboratively align with school-wide goals?
Absolutely. So we, at the beginning of the year, when you're doing your school plan, obviously the school establishes goals, and one of our goals actually recently was formative assessment. And so as a math team, with that being a goal, we sat down and had to have a discussion on, well, what does that look like for our classes? And we all agreed that if there was commonality in what formative assessment was, and obviously there is differences, and you don't always have to do one type of formative assessment for all junior high and all high school. But if we had some sort of commonality, something that students could expect and create a culture around that, you can always sprinkle in different things. Formative looks like a million different things. But if we had decided that these work booklets that we were going to do, the test booklets, and we call them les livrets de test à 100%, which means that the students are working to get 100%, and it's a low risk. You keep working, the teacher gives feedback, or they get feedback from their peers and so on, so that the students are learning from their mistakes and continuing to strive. And there's the culture that making mistakes, that's okay, and that's how you learn. And we, as a department, with the formative assessments being our main goal, had decided that was the main way we were going to incorporate that into our teaching. And then, of course, the formative is a reflection of what they're going to see on the summative. And so we see that, the more practice they do, the better prepared they are for summatives, and then the summatives aren't so scary.
So nothing comes without challenge. Can you speak to any challenges that have arisen or may arise within a collaborative working environment? And how has your team worked to overcome them?
Absolutely. Whenever you're collaborating with anyone, then there's differences of opinions, there's differences of approaches. Anytime you're discussing assessments, we have found that, people have different opinions on how challenging should the assessment be. And we also have some of us are more willing to do newer conceptual approaches, and some of us are more willing to stick to what we know and what we know works and does well with the students. So I think it's about embracing variety and embracing diversity. And you cannot all be uniform robots. That's not going to work. But being willing to have those discussions. It is scary to make assessments and then have a colleague judge what you have done. And so I think that a lot of times people don't share, or people don't collaborate for that reason, because when you put yourself out there and then, you have a colleague say, hey, you made a mistake in the solution, or even in French, you misspelt that word, or the conjugation isn't right, or the way you ask that is awkward. It doesn't make sense. You just kind of have to push away your pride a little bit and your ego. And that's how I have learned. And when I first started, you are only going to learn by participating, and you're only going to grow by trying. And so I have learned a lot from my colleagues, but I've also learned, last year I participated in the CSA item writing. And so you write, and then you have a group of people look at your question and then pick it apart. But you learn so much on item writing, and you get better at it. So I think it's being willing to kind of set your ego aside and being willing to make mistakes so that you can further your teaching practice, and it's for the benefit of students, honestly. The other challenge is time, of course, that a lot of us with our schedules, we're not always able to do all that math work at school right after school. We're doing that at home. So like I said, coming back to the team's communication and meeting in person when you can, but it's keeping the communication going. And so it also helps. There are benefits. It helps with understanding pacing, and it keeps you kind of on check. But there are challenges. Like, everybody does pacing differently as well, and so there's lots of challenges that come with it. It's not without challenges, and I understand why creating that collaborative culture is hard to start. But I was really fortunate to kind of be brought into it. But I would encourage anyone who's listening that it is worth it, and it has, I feel, created a really cohesive team and a really beneficial environment for students.
So, lastly, we're coming to the end of the episode. What advice do you have for other math teachers or teams who are looking to establish a culture of collaboration and aligned assessments?
My advice would just be to, like I had previously mentioned, kind of set your ego aside, and don't be afraid to make mistakes, and reaching out to colleagues and asking for their advice and having those discussions is always more important than feeling uncomfortable. So I've found it in the beginning, when you're first starting out as a teacher and you're new, it's intimidating, and it's can be overwhelming. But I think that ultimately leads to less stress, honestly, because you've got a team behind you, and you've got people that are willing to mentor, and then eventually you become more comfortable and you become the mentor to other teachers. And so that has been really, really great to know that when I first started, I was the newbie and didn't really have a lot to give. I was more on the, help and receiving end of support. And now that I've been at the school for a few years, I'm able to provide that community and support and encouragement to some newer teachers. So I would say just go for it.
And I'm going to ask one last question. It's a question I want to start embedding into the podcast. As teachers, we're dreamers. We want the best for our students and the best for society. So what's one dream you have for education?
My dream is that that's a loaded question. I'd say my dream is that we can reach the kids that are really, really far back, or they have major gaps in math. I think it is hard to teach math when you see kids that are just so far behind, and you see the devastation for them. As a kid, it's overwhelming for them. And I guess my dream would be that we're able to better, or I guess be better equipped to help those students, because it's a lot of pressure for the teacher, and it's a lot of, I go home at night thinking about, how am I going to get this kid to where they need to be? And I think that that's a lot of stress and weight to carry. And I think it's also, equally as hard for the student and you see students give up all the time because they feel like they're so behind. So I think that, just becoming better. I guess my dream would just be so that teachers are better equipped to help out those kids, so that we can close the gaps.
Close the gaps. Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful dream to have, and let's keep working towards that. Well, thanks so much for being on the show, Lise, and hopefully we can hear from you again on a future episode.
Thank you, Julia.
What? Are we still doing that? Lecture only instruction? Okay, we've all been at that lecture where the teacher maybe has gone on and on and on, and we start to fade out, or we lose our attention span kind of diminishes. There is a time and place for lecture style teaching. And not only to be confused with direct instruction, because direct instruction does have a time and a place. And that's where we explicitly have to teach a concept or a portion of that outcome or curriculum by speaking, by sharing information. Maybe it's surface level, maybe it's giving guidance or directions. Just as much as we want to give students every reasonable opportunity to demonstrate their learning through an array of conversations, observations, products, through a multimodal way of expression. We just don't want students to give us a verbal response or just a written response. There are many ways that they can demonstrate what they know. So conversely, it's important for us as the teachers to have an array of teaching strategies and methodologies in terms of sharing that content. And so let's be mindful of not just standing and delivering, not just being the sage on the stage, but maybe more that guide on the side and unlocking the learning. Have students be part of leading some of that learning, small group instruction, project-based learning, leveraging technology in different ways. So yes, there's a time and a place for lecture, but if that's your go-to, if that's the bulk of your practice, probably we need to rethink that. I don't know. What do you think?
We're now at the end of the episode. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Lise Hartzell for her insights into collaboration within the math department at her school. Thank you to both Nicole Lafreniere and Tim Cusack for your segments. And last but not least, to you, our listeners, thank you for tuning into the episodes here on The Learning Curve. A reminder, we're releasing episodes bi-weekly, with each episode featuring different voices and perspectives. Please like and subscribe to this channel to stay up to date with each release. In the meantime, follow us on Instagram at ECSD Learning, our YouTube channel at ECSD Learning, and check out our many resources on our SharePoint site, bit.ly/assessment-ECSD. All 3 links are in the episode description. Lastly, we want to hear from you, both on Spotify and on Instagram. Please share with us your classroom experiences with assessment or anything that you'd like us to discuss on this podcast. That's our time. See you next week on The Learning Curve.